I want to welcome you to eProfessionalism and ePortfolios. Are they compatible with in the undergraduate nursing curriculum? I just want to let you know we're using automated Zoom captions during this live event. We'll edit those transcripts before we share recordings with you so that they're more accurate, but you should see those appearing at the bottom of your screen. If you find those captions to be distracting, you can make them go away by just clicking on that live transcript icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the presentation, feel free to pose questions to the chat. I will be monitoring that for us. And towards the end of the hour, we'll share how we can continue the conversation online, as well as some additional resources to support your teaching from ABLE. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nuala Devlin, who is from Queen's University in Belfast.
Hi, thank you very much, Amy, and hello everybody from County Kerry. So I actually work in Queen's University Belfast, but I'm actually on holiday at the minute in County Kerry. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to turn my camera off because the reception isn't great, because we're in the wilds of mountainous regions and the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. So it's not sometimes that compatible with Wi-Fi. So just to improve my bandwidth, I'm going to turn off my camera in a few minutes, but I just wanted to introduce myself first and tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Nuala Devlin, and I'm a lecturer in education in Queen's University Belfast within the School of Nursing and Midwifery, and we're part of the Faculty of Medicine, Health and Life Sciences. And my career really has been clinical up to this point. I worked as a ward manager in intensive care nursing for many, many years. So I'm a registered nurse by trade, qualifying many years ago, and worked really in a variety of different intensive care units across Ireland and across the UK, and worked as a manager, then worked as a service manager, and a service manager really was managing at an organisational level and not just at a departmental level and looking at critical care services. And I moved into academia and Queen's University just 4 years ago. It was a bit of a leap of faith, but the timing was right for me, and I really haven't looked back since. And so a lot of what I knew in terms of issues when I was working in practice, when I was working with pre-registration nurses so these are nurses within the UK and Ireland, our nurses within the UK particularly, our pre-registration programme is a 3-year programme, and that constitutes of a Bachelor of Science. It's an honours degree over 3 years. At the same time, the students are working towards their Nursing and Midwifery Council registration. So they're actually doing 2 qualifications within that 3 years. And as per the NMC, they have to do 2,300 clinical practice placement hours. So it's a bit full on. And they're not like normal students whereby they get lots of holidays at Christmas and over the summer, because they're obviously having to do placement hours. And when I worked in clinical practice, one of the things that I was acutely aware of was issues around professionalism. And really, there were issues around, did students really understand what that meant? And one of the first roles I had when I came into the university was to look at what was known as a regional electronic practice assessment document. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be calling it an e-portfolio, but essentially what that was how the students were able to document and evidence their clinical practice and how they were able to demonstrate that they had the necessary clinical attributes whenever they were out in practice. So these are mapped against the Nursing and Midwifery Council framework. So it's very distinctive in relation to what's being expected from the students. And that posed quite a few problems because it was a regional portfolio. So there were 3 universities involved, and it had to be mapped against the NMC standards. So if you can imagine, if you know Ireland, in the north of Ireland, we're still under we're under UK jurisdiction, but we're on the island of Ireland. And we have 3 universities in the north of Ireland who deliver the Nursing and Midwifery Council programmes and curriculums, and that is the Open University, the Ulster University, and ourselves at Queen's University Belfast. And there was huge challenges in relation to how we were going to be able to develop and then implement this e-portfolio. And what I want to share with you today is really a perspective of moving online with this regionally agreed practice portfolio, and indeed the challenges that we faced and how we were, I suppose, able to manage that really. So one of the first things that became really pertinent and became really quite evidenced very, very quickly to us and to myself was that we needed to develop an easily accessible teaching tool that would reflect modern technology. We needed to be able to introduce this regionally agreed e-portfolio, and we needed to be able to do it in a way to motivate nursing students to identify examples from their clinical experiences to promote professional development. And that really wasn't an easy task at all. It was very, very fraught because there were so many different people that we were having to take into consideration. So this is the logic model that I developed in order to implement this e-portfolio. And I am going to talk about the e-portfolio in greater depth at the end of this near the end of this presentation. But I just want to sort of give you the background and give you the context of what we were developing and what we were trying to manage. So this was a portfolio that initially had been designed to be a hard copy, a paper copy portfolio. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it became obviously very quickly a problem having paper portfolios within practice. It wasn't something that we were going to be able to use because of infection control issues, because of issues that we had in relation to sharing that data and people being able to use that data and people being able to sign in and out with different copies. So we regionally agreed between the 3 universities that we would put it onto an online platform, and e-portfolio pedagogy really lent itself to that. It was something that we were novices in. I was very much a novice in it. It's not something that is widely used within nursing, and it's certainly not something that is widely used within the UK. So we had a particular set of challenges. We were developing and we were delivering this new curriculum, and then we were having to transcribe really this portfolio and put it onto an online platform. And at the start of this project, I was acutely aware of the difficulties with that. And so one of the things that we did was, or one of the things that I did was put together this logic model. And the idea behind this logic model was to really try to give a sense of what were the inputs going to be, what were the outputs, and then what were the outcomes or the impact. So what were the priorities? And really it was around local dynamics and collaboration, because within the UK, our curriculum for pre-reg nursing is 50-50. So they spend 2,300 clinical practice placement hours, and that is with trusts. So they would be healthcare organisations, they could be acute hospitals, they could be nursing homes, they could be residential settings, but we're linked very clearly with them. And so they would work with registered nurses when they're out in these practice placement areas. And then they do 2,300 academic hours when they're with us in the university, but the university holds the responsibility for the whole programme. And so really getting engagement from our clinical practice colleagues was challenging because they were in obviously the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were still having to support our students. And while people could see the long-term benefit of moving onto an online platform and moving with an e-portfolio, it really was very challenging in terms of how we were going to engage with them. So in terms of inputs, obviously we were having to look at staff time, resources, the planning of time, money, the knowledge base, the expertise, materials, equipment, space, technology, and partners. Then we were looking at the outputs. So we were looking at participants, activities, and the directed products. We were also then looking at the who, the what, and the how. So really, who were we trying to engage and how were we going to engage with them? What sort of products were we going to be able to develop? And how were we going to be able to develop and deliver on those resources? And the how. So what sort of topic areas, what articles were we going to be looking at? How were we going to be able to deliver these in a succinct and good manner, effective manner? The next thing then that we were also looking at was the outcomes and the impact. And you can see here that we've broken it down into short-term and long-term goals. So obviously the long-term goals we were looking at were around awareness of knowledge, skills, attitude, interest, opinions, aspirations, intentions, and motivations. But then we were also looking at these long-term impacts and what that would mean to professionalism. And I knew that that was particularly a challenge because of my own clinical experience. So what did professionalism look like in terms of that reach, participation, and diversity? How were we going to be able to integrate that in terms of education? What was that going to look like in terms of connectivity, in terms of that reach and community engagement? And then finally, from an environmental point of view, what did that look like from a digital platform? So this was the biggest problem that I came across. The interchangeable way that people use the term portfolio, and what did they mean by portfolio? So because we were having so many different people engaging in this process, lots of different people had lots of different ideas of what they wanted the portfolio to do. And because this was being done in real time, and it was such a steep learning curve for all of us, I suppose in an ideal world, you would have obviously started with your co-design, and you would have started with your students and your stakeholders and your different people, and you would have been saying, well, what is it that you need, and what is it that we need to do, and what is it we need to make sure is integrated? And professionalism is an attribute, and it's a competency and proficiency that is integral to the nurse, and it's something that is very difficult to put your finger on. It's very difficult to quantify, but reflection is one of those key components of it. And really that's where we had, I suppose, the biggest challenges, because it became very clear to me during this process that lots of people had lots of different ideas as to what they wanted this portfolio to be, whether that was constructivist, whether they wanted, assessment portfolio, or whether they wanted a repository portfolio. And really what we wanted was a portfolio that was going to be able to incorporate all of these different elements. And that was obviously really ambitious, because we had really been given a template from which we had to work, whether we wanted to work from it or not. It was very clearly going to be an assessment portfolio, because there was specific criteria within it that was mapped against the NMC. proficiencies and the NMC competencies. It also had to have reflection within it. So there needed to be elements of obviously a constructive, an e-learning, e-portfolio, and a constructive fist component to it, because students were going to have to be able to reflect within it, and they were going to have to be able to demonstrate that they could adequately reflect. And then it also had to be a repository, because students had to be able to demonstrate their creativity, and they had to be able to also showcase things that they had done above and beyond maybe particular aspects of their role. And I suppose, you know, we're a year down the line now from this, and they're probably, you know, when I look back, I sort of look back and I think, my goodness, how naive we were in terms of trying to pull this all together and actually trying to make sure that what we did was going to be able to meet all of these different components. And when I worked with staff as well, that was something that was also very tricky, because they had different ideas as well in terms of what did professionalism look like, and what did you know, what that actually looked like for them. And professionalism is really very much around tacit knowledge. You know, it's really about how someone engages with their patients, how they engage with each other, and then how was that going to be captured within the portfolio. And anecdotally, I was aware of issues around professionalism when students were using hard copy portfolios. When they were using hard copy portfolios, occasionally you would have had students who were maybe putting in entries that weren't particularly accurate, maybe entries around timesheets, entries around, you know, skills that they had completed. And one of the benefits of having this online platform was the governance around it, and the fact that it was going to be much tighter, and the fact that that wouldn't be allowed. So when we were working with this, the software engineers, and when we were working with the supplier who were going to help us put this onto an online platform, they were some of the key things that we were having to think about in terms of, well, what was that actually going to look like in terms of the students, and how they were going to actually evidence within this. So it became very clear to me very quickly as we started off in this process that professionalism and how a student behaved on an electronic platform was really very, very challenging. And unfortunately, it became apparent very quickly that some students didn't really understand that how they conducted themselves on this online platform actually was an extension of their professionalism. So we had some students who got themselves into issues very early on, whereby one of the governance arrangements around it was, if I had completed a task, then that has to be signed off by the registrant. So a registered nurse has to physically put their email address in, and they have to sign off the task that I had done, that I had completed. So that was equivalent to a wet signature. And some students, because they knew their registrants, emails, they thought it was okay to actually put that in themselves, when obviously it wasn't okay. So we had a few issues like that, but it actually opened up a whole Pandora's box, really, because it meant then for some students, they were saying, well, they weren't actually aware that that was an issue. And they couldn't understand why they were being brought to health and conduct, or why they were being brought to fitness to practice because of it. The other issue that we had was some students couldn't really understand that this was such an important document, and they couldn't actually see that it was an extension again of their. It was an extension of their actual being. So this development of the e-portfolio, really, it was around the method of assessment and what were those theoretical underpinnings of this learning. And we really needed to sort of start with the students and explain to them that this could either be experiential or it could be reflective. And this personal reflection, particularly, and how the student adapt and modified their approach was based on their experience in this tacit knowledge. And learning from this experience was crucial for the student to develop this competency, taking responsibility for their learning, this subjective nature of reflection and the introspection that it requires means that it can be challenging to evaluate in objective terms what the student has actually achieved. And I recognised very quickly that e-portfolios offered a more comprehensive vehicle to showcase the student's competency over their journey. And it facilitated a more integrated approach, which is fundamental to lifelong learning. The construct of an e-portfolio can often be contradictory. And actually that was really what I found at the start of this process, because it was really difficult to help the student understand what evidence was required. And this caused great difficulty when designing the portfolio, because our portfolio needed to have both formative and summative functions within this portfolio. And that was quite difficult to achieve. And we needed a flexible, adaptable portfolio which would facilitate the building of evidence and allow development while assessing the student against set proficiencies. We needed the student to understand that there had to be a space to take ownership of their learning and adapt as they continued their journey, because this portfolio will be with them over the 3 years. And all of this evidence is required. So within the portfolio, it's known as part 1, which is year 1, part 2, which is year 2, and part 3, which is year 3. And at the end of the 3rd year, or the end of part 3, they have to have been able to demonstrate within the portfolio that they have met all of the NMC competencies and proficiencies over the whole of the 3 years before they can be signed off. And before they can be signed off and recommended for their professional qualification. And when used correctly, I have started to become aware of the fact that this actually, if an e-portfolio is used correctly, it can lead to increased academic performance. It can lead to active learning with a deepened connection, and it can allow the student to work through what they know rather just on working on single deliverables. And it can allow the student to work through what they know, establishing goal setting unique to the student. So they can identify the learning strategies which are applicable to them, which in turn forces the student to engage with professional development, preparing students to develop a strong and professional digital presence, which then can be evaluated by potential employers. And e-portfolios have a unique capacity to measure professionalism, assess professional development, and juxtapose students' progress against professional criteria over time. It is important to recognise within nursing that no one single assessment method can realistically and holistically measure a student's knowledge, skill, and professionalism. It's a complex approach utilising a variety of methods, experiences, interprofessional and interpersonal interactions that can lead the assessor to make these judgments. The need for all involved to be authentically and critically engaged in the process of lifelong learning to ensure the patient care remains a central tenet. And that's why it comes back to this struggle, I suppose, about what type of portfolio we needed, and the fact that we needed it to be more than just one. It needed to be more than the sum of its parts. So it needed to have those elements within a constructivist model, whereby the student is able to include a reflection process as well as a focus on the learning process. It also needed to have, that positivist model, whereby assessment was integral to it at a program level, and they were able to demonstrate specific criteria or competencies. The portfolio needed also to have that repository or showcase element to it, whereby they didn't necessarily map out against learning outcomes, but they could showcase their best work and highlight accomplishments, and that the student could demonstrate where possible the creativity, allowing the student to take accountability of what and how evidence is mapped against the bespoke and prerequisite outcomes. So it needed to be all things to all people, really. And I suppose that was really why it has been, and it was such a challenge, and continues to be a challenge, to be honest with you. If I'm being perfectly honest, the further we go through this process, the more questions I have about it, in terms of how can I ensure that the students are safe within this online platform? How can I be sure that they can understand that this is an extension of their professional being? And I have started to become to realise that next generation portfolios can provide a cohesive structure linking the students' past, present and future work, that they can display development and learning throughout their journey, and that linking nursing to practice is an old problem within nursing. Theory to practice gap is well evidenced in the literature, and actually Yancey in 2019 posits that an e-portfolio can be seen as a continuum of integration of student learning. And I think it's that aspect of it which is particularly challenging for me as an academic lead for practice, as a registered nurse, as someone who has been tasked to lead on this across the organisation and within the region. Because there's so many different variables that can affect not just the student, but that can affect the student. You know, there's so many people that are involved in order to give the student a holistic assessment, and that's needed. And I suppose it's about how I, as an educator, can make sure that the student understands that, and really they start to build those skills for the future as well, because this is something that they're going to be expected to do once they're registered as well. The Nursing and Midwifery Council within the UK, you know, we have to obviously validate, we have to revalidate every year, and you know, that process of revalidation, you know, we have to be able to demonstrate through reflective accounts how we have actually been able to keep current. So this is something that is going to be lifelong learning. And rather, you know, I suppose depending on its function and use, it could be seen as either a mechanism to capture evidence of learning or an extension of the curriculum, whereby the portfolio stimulates the learning. And one of the articles that I read as I was beginning this journey was by Matthews de Natal in 2019, and they proposed that the most important conversation needed around e-portfolios is to reconceptualize it from a noun, i.e. a product, to a verb, i.e. a process. And that has really struck me, because to engage the students, the e-portfolios need to be done well. And you know, there's different hypotheses in terms of how we can help students understand the many variables that are needed to be incorporated to succeed. And you know, there is literature there that would support and propose that to be successful, the platform and construct of the portfolio must have the following: a learning core which comprises of students, faculty and an institutional culture, interlocking sectors which embraces, integrative with social pedagogy, professional development, outcomes assessment, technology and scaling up. And the design principles must involve inquiry, learning, pedagogy, reflection, integration. The implementation and sustainability as a product needs to be challenged at all levels. And really, we need to think about how we focus on the process of how our students engage with it on a professional level. And so there's tough questions that need to be answered in relation to this. And as we started on this process, it became apparent that really there needed to be a suite of resources that needed to sit alongside the e-portfolio. And so I started to develop a selection of handbooks, videos, templates, notebooks, etc. I also started to hold a digital drop-in clinic, which I still hold every Friday from 12 to 1. And that's for all students across the region, but it's also for practice staff and for academic staff. So it's really for anybody who has issues with the portfolio or having issues of how they're evidencing it within practice. And it was during those digital drop-in clinics that it became apparent to me that there were issues around online professionalism. And when I started to survey students and speak to students about what did online professionalism or e-professionalism, what did that mean to them? For a lot of them, they just assumed that online or e-professionalism was around social media. So they didn't see what they were putting into their portfolio, even though it was online and it was an e-portfolio. They didn't see that as pertaining to professionalism in any way. They didn't see it as something that they should be concerned about. And really the issues around confidentiality, being anonymous, digital footprints, that wasn't something that they really thought about too much, to be honest with you. They didn't really think about the fact that what they were putting in as a first year or a second year, or what maybe staff were putting into their portfolios could potentially be challenging for them, or that when they move forward, that it would be potentially something that they would have to be concerned about. So it was really, really important that whenever I was engaging with the students at this local level, especially through the drop-in clinics, we hold them on Teams, Microsoft Teams platform, and it means that students, when they're out in practice, can log in from any device, and they can bring along their practice assessors as well. And it meant that you could start to really, in real time, start to engage the students around what their issues were. And it was really important to recognise that for students, this complex approach of assessment and the variety of methods, experience, interpersonal interactions that the assessor had to make, these judgments, that these all had to be authentically and critically engaged in the process of lifelong learning. And that was something that a lot of students really struggled with, because they really didn't, when you talked about them about online professionalism, and when you talked about the fact that, for example, they had entered someone's email address in and they thought that that was okay, and when you're saying to them, but that's actually the equivalent to a wet signature, so you shouldn't be putting in somebody's email address, they have to put that in themselves. For a lot of them, they find that leap quite difficult, and they find it quite difficult to understand. And the fact that this portfolio pedagogy and this e-portfolio pedagogy was responsive, it meant that we were able to start to facilitate and foster this clinically based learning. And the fact that we had used a logic model as a framework to do that meant that we were able to start to really contextualize what the issues were. Because we had moved online with a portfolio and we had put it online, but actually all of the prep work that should have been done was being, prior to going online, was being done alongside it. So the lines were blurred around performance and assessment. And that's why I feel that there was confusion around the expectations, because the setting of performance and assessment wasn't clearly articulated. So so to give you an example, for some students, they couldn't really understand what was the context of the portfolio. They struggled to understand what validation methods were being used. And they were struggling to understand what the theoretical underpinnings of this learning would be. And we were expecting the students to be able to, I suppose, understand all of that, but at the same time understand that this was an assessment process and that this was something that they were being assessed against, and it was being mapped against the NMC proficiencies. And we were expecting the students to learn from these experiences as well. And we were expecting them to learn from these experiences and for a professional to be able to develop this competency and take responsibility for their learning. So we were asking them to do an awful lot. And the logic model was really helpful because it meant, because I had broken it into, right, what was the situation and what were the priorities, I could see very clearly when I was noticing problems, I could map that back to whether that was an issue with the input, whether that was an issue with the output, or whether that was an issue with the outcome. And the thing that kept coming up each time was professionalism, and the fact that that was being mapped against the fact that, you know, we were expecting students to engage with this on a professional platform. We were expecting students to identify and to manage their presence in a professional manner. But actually, the input in terms of resources and equipment and technology and the knowledge base, that was missing. You know, so we were nearly working backwards, because we were I was trying to then develop this suite of resources at the same time. So with subsequent cohorts, I've been able to embed, I suppose, a lot of these resources prior to them actually, before they even look at the portfolio, before they even see the portfolio. I'm able to work with the students on a one-to-one. I'm able to work with them within the university, and I'm able to say to them, okay, these are issues around, these are some of the issues that you might come across. These are some of the issues that you have to consider. And these are some of the issues that you're going to need to be mindful of moving forward. And that's been really, really helpful, because we launched this product in January 21. And we're now July 2022. So we're only 18 months into it, really. And we haven't had a full cohort through it yet. You know, we've had cohorts who have started on it, who have yet to qualify, and we have students who came onto it, but who were on a different portfolio. So they had like a hybrid. They had two models that they had to work from. And it really started to pique my interest, because obviously from a clinical point of view, I knew there were issues with professionalism, but this project particularly really started to make me realize that there was issues with e-professionalism for student nurses. And it was really something about how could we support them? You know, how could we support students, and how could we make sure that students understood moving forward what the issues were. And that's been really interesting, because I've been very fortunate in that I've had some very supportive colleagues, and I have started to read round, and it's actually now developed into a PhD study, whereby I'm looking at how we can support students, because there's some really important questions that need to be answered. Because although the pandemic has changed the way we work, the skills, attributes, and knowledge needed for future nurses remains resolute. So how we support students on their journey to engage professionally on an electronic platform warrants further exploration. The increased use of e-portfolios within nurse education comes with an expectation of digital literacy, capability, and an ability to navigate professionally in the electronic world. Currently, e-professionalism is seen within the domains of social media platforms. However, it's quite apparent to me that nursing as a profession need to be more proactive, preparing our future workforce to ensure e-professionalism is seen through a variety of lenses. And there's some tough questions that need answered. How does practice connect? with a portfolio. What do students, academics and practice staff do? How is reflection and integration manifested? How does this deepen the student, faculty and practice learning? How does each sector connect with each other? Does outcome assessment work with the ePortfolio pedagogy and vice versa? What is the evidence of impact? And what is the synergy, i.e. the common thread? And without doubt, the common thread that has been very, very apparent to me is the fact that students don't know how to engage on a portfolio, on an e-learning platform. And this is, led to further questions. So how can the ePortfolio, and in what capacity can it support students to navigate? And how does that digital presence, and how does the ePortfolio support that? So that's the end of the presentation. I'm finished just 10 minutes before the end of the session to welcome any questions. This is a list of references that I've used throughout the presentation. If you want to look at any of those, or if you wanted to have any further reading, and I'm happy to take questions on what I've just delivered.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Nuala. One question that came up in the chat, folks were really interested in the logic model that you shared with us. And they were wondering if you'd be willing to share your slides with us so that they could view that logic model more closely.
Yes, of course, the slides are, I'm more than happy to share the slides. You're more than welcome. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, no problem at all.
Thank you so much. I know selfishly, I would love to hear more. You mentioned you use that logic model to kind of plan your process, which was very cool. But then you said you also used it to map things. I would love to just hear more about that process.
Yeah, of course. So basically it meant that when you start off with a logic model, now the logic model, it allows you, it's nearly like a mind map. It allows you to sit down and think to yourself, well, what is it that I'm hopefully going to achieve, and what do I need to do that, really? And so you were able to sit down and, well, so I sat down and thought about, well, what is it that we have to do, and who is it we're engaging, and how are we going to be able to engage them? So it's about that who, what and why, and then what potentially are going to be the outcomes, either short-term outcomes or long-term outcomes or impacts. And whenever you start to look at it and you start to see which impacts you're getting, you can also then see which impacts you're not getting. So you can start to look at the fact that, okay, well, and professionalism seems to be a real issue here. So that was the thing that kept coming back. The fact that they didn't seem to know or understand what that looked like on a digital platform. And the thing that kept coming back was the fact that they didn't have the appropriate learning. They didn't have the appropriate resources. So that's what was missing in terms of your input. So whenever you start to work out with your logic model, you can see very clearly what you're doing and what you're doing well. And then you can also see where the gaps are. And that makes it much easier then to go back and think, right, well, that's what we need to do. And then that's where the further study has come from. The fact that the ePortfolio, we have given the students this ePortfolio and we've expected them to do all things with it. But actually, we didn't give them the necessary tools to navigate it successfully. And if we're going to manage it properly, we're going to have to make sure that those resources are in place. So it's about how we do that and what we need to do. And I think, to be honest with you, I don't have the answer yet. I don't know whether it's something that needs to be embedded within the curriculum, whether they need to do maybe, whether we need to maybe develop a module on e-professionalism. Maybe we need to develop a module on, like a pre and post design, maybe. Test, do we need to develop a module on professionalism? Do we need to develop what that looks like, what the issues are, what the pitfalls are, and then how do we develop that so that when they are then working on the portfolio, they're not going to fall into these traps, because at the minute the students don't understand, they don't make they're not making the connection that the fact that this is electronic. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that within the UK we're really far behind in terms of what e-portfolios are used for and what their potential are. We don't use them. This is, it was such a steep learning curve. We had nobody else to go on. It wasn't like you could go to a different university and ask them. A lot of what people used were things like Word documents that were basically just functionalized. And our portfolio has elements of that in it, but it's also, like I say, it has all three aspects of it, and that's why it has been, I suppose, such a challenge. Does that answer the question, Amy?
It does. Thank you. We do have a couple of minutes left if anyone has any other questions for our presenter. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. And there were so many, I think, really resonating points that you had that I'm sure all of us can identify with in our own local experiences of e-portfolios. So thank you all so much for attending.